He had never hesitated. Not once in 11 years on the throne. Not over executions, not over wars, not over the men he had loved and buried in the same frozen ground. His council called it discipline. His enemies called it something colder. The wolves who had followed him into the Harrow Rebellion and watched him make decisions in burning corridors with bodies at his feet called it the only reason any of them were still breathing. Hesitation was the thing that turned kings into warnings. Caius Vale had never given anyone a reason to use him as one. So when the doors opened and they dragged her in, he straightened, reached for the certainty that had never once failed him, and found nothing. She was filthy, chained, one eye swollen, half shut, dark auburn hair plastered across her face like she had fought every step of the corridor to get here. She did not look broken. She looked, and this was the thing, the specific, unbearable thing, like she was the one conducting an assessment, like she had walked into this chamber the way you walked into any dangerous room, cataloging exits, reading faces, deciding who was the most important person to watch. Her eyes found his. She did not look away. 40 wolves waited for the word. Lord Dravian stood to his left with the sentence already signed, already finished, already a formality. Caius opened his mouth. His wolf was gone. Vanished. The kill command hit silence, and the silence hit back. And for the first time in 11 years, he stood in front of his court and felt something move through him that he did not have a name for. Release her. 2 words, spoken in the same voice he used to end wars, to authorize executions, to deliver verdicts that could not be appealed, the voice that had never wavered. It did not waver now, but the words were wrong, and every wolf in the room knew it. And the silence that followed was the specific silence of 40 wolves deciding simultaneously that they had heard incorrectly, that their king had not just done what he had unmistakably done. Dravian turned to him slowly. "Alpha King, you heard me." He watched his council's faces change, watched the careful neutral masks crack at the edges, watched the calculations begin behind careful eyes, the rapid, dangerous arithmetic of powerful wolves understanding that something had just shifted in the foundation of everything they had built their safety on. He had broken something. He already knew he could not repair it. The border reports arrived before dawn. 3 skirmishes, 2 dead, 1 outpost abandoned without orders, which meant the wolves manning it had not waited for permission, had simply read the pardon the only way powerful wolves ever read weakness in a king, as invitation. Caius stood at the war table alone and felt the particular, terrible clarity of a man watching consequences arrive exactly as predicted. He had known this would happen. He had granted the pardon anyway. That knowledge sat in his chest like swallowed glass. Not regret, not yet, but the sharp awareness that regret was coming and would not be small. He had assigned Soren to April before the chamber had fully emptied. Strategic detention, he told himself. Intelligence. Leverage. A resource, not a mercy. He was still telling himself that when Mother Voss spoke from the doorway. "You should eat something." He did not turn. Mother Voss. She moved into the room without apology, without announcement, as though the castle belonged to her in some older and more permanent way than it would ever belong to him. Ancient in the way certain things were ancient. Not fragile, accumulated. "I watched them bring her in," she said. "Everyone watched. I watched you." She stopped beside the table. He felt her eyes on the side of his face the way you felt weather changing. Your wolf recognized her before your eyes finished opening. That is not instinct. That is not strength. A pause, deliberate and weighted. That is a door you have left unlocked in a kingdom full of wolves already looking for ways inside. He turned, looked at her fully. "You are wrong," he said. She nodded, slowly. The nod of a woman who had been told she was wrong by kings before and had simply outlived them all. She left without another word. Caius turned back to the reports, hands flat on the table. Controlled. Everything exactly as it should be. By mid-morning, the council override clause had been formally invoked. 3 noble houses could reverse a king's decision if the vote carried, and Caius had 72 hours before the tally came back. He read the invocation notice once, set it down, and spent the next 4 hours in back-to-back briefings about border reinforcement, diplomatic fallout, and the 3 separate noble delegations demanding private audiences he had no intention of granting. He did not visit April. He told himself this was strategy. Distance, the deliberate management of a situation that required cold handling. His wolf told him nothing. That silence, he was beginning to understand, was not absence. It was patience. She was sitting on the floor when he arrived. Not hunched against the wall, not curled into herself the way prisoners learned to make themselves small. Cross-legged in the center of the room, like she had considered the bed and the chair and chosen the floor deliberately. Her wrists were raw from the chains. She had torn a strip from her dress hem and wrapped the worst of it herself. She looked up when he entered. She did not stand. Something moved through Caius's chest that he did not examine. He pulled the chair from the corner, turned it backward, sat, bringing himself to her eye level with the deliberateness of a man who understood that height was a weapon and had chosen, for reasons he could not explain, not to use it. "Who sent you?" he said. "Which answer gets me out of this room?" "None of them." "Who sent you?" She tilted her head, studied him the way he was studying her, methodically, without pretense, cataloging details she might need later. "You already have my file. You know who they say sent me. I'm asking what you say." "I say," she replied carefully, "that the people who wrote that file had reasons to write it the way they did, and that reasons matter more than facts when someone needs a verdict to come out a certain way." "That is not an answer." "No," she agreed, "but it's more honest than one would have been." The silence between them had texture, the specific weight of 2 people refusing to look away while understanding that looking away would be the safer choice. He noticed the burn scar on her right forearm. Small. Old. She did not cover it, did not explain it. He filed it away. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It came out less like an accusation and more like something he was still working out. She was quiet for a moment, and then something shifted in her face, fast, involuntary, completely unguarded. Not fear, something rawer than fear. "I'm terrified," she said quietly. "I've been terrified since they put the chains on." She held his gaze, and the honesty in it was so undefended that it landed like a physical thing. I don't know how to perform it for you. I don't know what shape of scared keeps me alive in this room." Her voice dropped. "So I stopped trying to figure it out." The admission hung in the air between them. He had interrogated wolves twice her size, who had never once told him a true thing. "Should I be afraid of you?" she asked. He left without answering. He was halfway down the corridor when Soren fell into step beside him, a folded report already extended. 7 dead on the border. 7 since dawn. Caius folded the report once, twice, and kept walking, because if he stopped, if he stood still for even a moment with the number in his hand and her voice still in his ears, he was not certain what his face would do. Behind the guarded door, April sat back down on the floor. The admission had been real. The terror had been real. She had not planned to let him see it. had not planned any of the last 4 minutes, which was the problem, which was the thing she could not afford, which was why her hands were not entirely steady as she reached beneath the loose stone in the corner she had found within the first hour. The message was still there. She had not yet decided whether to send it. He heard it before the alarm was raised. Not the sound of the attack. The castle was old and thick-walled and swallowed noise like deep water swallowed stone. What he heard was the silence that preceded it. The specific, wrong silence of a corridor that should have had a guard at its end and did not. Caius was moving before he had consciously decided to move. He took the first wolf at the stairwell, fast, efficient, no hesitation. The second at the doorway with the kind of violence that came not from training, but from something older and less controlled. The third was already inside the room when Caius's hand closed around his throat from behind. It did not take long after that. When the room went still, he turned. April was pressed against the far wall, a broken chair leg in her grip, blood at her temple from the edge of the table, but her eyes were clear, her stance was set, and she was already scanning the room, counting, confirming, the way soldiers confirmed. She looked at him. His hands were shaking. Not from the fight. He had killed cleaner in worse circumstances and felt nothing but the mechanical satisfaction of a threat removed. This was different. This was his body understanding something his mind was still refusing to process. That 30 seconds earlier, she had almost been gone. That the room had almost been empty. That the particular quality of light on her face right now had nearly ceased to exist in the world. He put his hands behind his back before she could see. Soren arrived 11 seconds later, took in the bodies, took in April, took in Caius, standing very still. He filed it away and said nothing. Soren said nothing, because Soren understood that saying nothing was sometimes the only form of loyalty left available. But he had seen the hands. He had seen the 11 seconds it took him to arrive, 11 seconds in which Caius had crossed half the castle on nothing but instinct, bypassing protocol, abandoning command, moving like a wolf whose mate was in danger, rather than a king whose asset required protection. He waited until Caius had left the room, then he crouched beside the nearest body and looked at the quality of the equipment, the boots, the specific cut of the clothing. Castle issued. Modified, but originally castle issued. Someone with procurement access had dressed these wolves. Someone with access to the guard rotation had moved them through. Soren stood, began, quietly and without authorization, to pull Drevian supply records for the last 6 months. The override vote came back an hour before midnight. 2 houses against the pardon. 1 abstained, which in the political language of this kingdom meant the 3rd house was waiting to see which way the wind blew before committing to anything as permanent as an opinion. 48 hours remaining. Caius stood at the war table while Soren read the tally and thought about 3 attackers who moved through a guarded castle corridor with castle-issued equipment, which meant keys, which meant access, which meant someone on his council had looked him in the eye today and smiled and already given the order before the chamber had finished emptying. "Pull Drevian's correspondence," he said quietly. "Everything. Last 6 months." Quietly? Very. Alone, he unclasped his hands, looked at them. Steady now. Everything back under control. His wolf was not fooled. Behind 4 guards instead of 2, April pressed a cloth to her temple and thought about the 3 wolves who had come through her window. She had recognized one of them. Not his face, his hands, the specific calluses on the knuckles, the way he had moved through the dark, the technique he had used reaching for her. She had seen that technique demonstrated once in a training yard by someone she had been told worked for the faction that had sent her here. But the faction that sent her had not ordered this. She was certain of that the way you were certain of things that had kept you alive long enough to be certain of anything. Which meant the attack had come from somewhere else. Which meant there were not 2 players in this game. which meant the message beneath the stone needed to warn someone, and she was running out of time to decide who. She almost made it. That was the part that stayed with him, not the escape itself, not the knotted bed sheets, not the guard she had put down with a technique that had no business existing in a human woman's body. What stayed was the 12 inches of clearance she'd had at the top of the east wall before his hand closed around her wrist. 12 inches from gone. He pulled her back with enough force that she spun into the wall, and for one suspended moment, they were close enough that he could feel her breath, and he watched the exact instant she decided not to fight him. Not from fear, from calculation. The rapid recalibration of a person who had just lost one option and was already identifying the next. "Don't," he said. One word, everything in it. She looked up at him in the dark and said nothing. He did not release her wrist. "The people who sent 3 wolves through your window," he said quietly, "were not the faction in your file." Something moved behind her eyes, fast, involuntary, gone before it fully formed, but he had been reading faces across council tables for 11 years, and he caught it like a blade caught light. "You already knew that," he said. She turned her face away. April. Her name in his mouth. First time. She felt it land somewhere it should not have. "There are 3 factions," she said, to the wall, to the dark, to anywhere that wasn't his face. "Not 2. The faction your council built collapsed them into one picture. One picture is easier to prosecute." A pause. "The faction that sent me is not the faction trying to kill me." "And the 3rd? Silence. She pressed back against the wall. He could feel the bond, new, impossible, not yet acknowledged between them, pulling in the space where her answer should have been. "The 3rd, he said again, "is closer than the other 2. Her voice was barely sound. "That is all I can give you. I can't—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. He understood she was not protecting herself, she was protecting someone else. Someone still alive, still in position. Someone whose cover would collapse the moment she named them. "Take me back inside, Caius." He did. He did not speak on the walk back. Soren fell into step and said nothing either, and the silence between all 3 of them was the specific silence of people assembling different pieces of the same puzzle and beginning to understand the image was worse than any of them had anticipated. He went to his study and spread everything across the table. The file, the border reports, Drevian's correspondence, the assassination evidence. 3 factions, not 2. The 3rd one closest. He looked at it all together for the first time and felt the shape of something enormous and unfinished moving in the dark just beyond the edge of what he could see. He looked up. Mother Voss passed the open doorway, candle in hand, moving toward the old council hall, the way she moved through everything, without acknowledgement of anyone else's urgency, without the performance of concern. She did not slow, did not look in. She simply passed, and somehow that was worse than anything she could have said, because it meant she had already seen where this was going and had decided that watching was all that was left to do now. On the table, half buried beneath Drevian's letters, a single name appeared in the border report casualty list. Caius went still. The name belonged to a wolf who reported directly to Soren, a wolf who had been assigned to internal communications, to the movement of information between the war room, the council, and the border commanders. A wolf with access to every sensitive document Caius had generated in the last 60 days. A wolf who had no business being anywhere near the northern border. He read the entry twice, the date, the location, the cause. Then he sat back slowly and understood that whoever was running the 3rd faction had just sent him a message more clearly than any cipher, and the message was, "We are not hiding anymore." The candle in the corridor had long since disappeared. He was entirely alone. The blade came through the window at midnight. Not a wolf, a human, which was worse because humans could go places wolves could not, could smell like nothing, could move through a castle full of supernatural predators like smoke through a keyhole. The assassin made it 12 feet from Caius's door before the ward triggers Soren had installed without announcement detonated in a cascade of contained light and noise that locked down the entire east wing in under 4 seconds. 6 hours minimum, the protocol said. Nothing in, nothing out, until every corridor had been swept twice, which meant Caius was locked in the east wing, where April's room was. He found her already awake, already on her feet, the chair leg from 3 nights ago still propped against the wall within arm's reach. She had heard the trigger. She had not panicked. She had armed herself. He stepped inside, closed the door. They looked at each other across 6 feet of charged silence. Second attempt in 4 days. Yours this time. Yes. Getting closer. Yes. She studied him, that inventory look, methodical and unhurried, and then she crossed to the window and sat on the ledge, knees drawn up, looking out at the locked-down dark like a woman settling in for something she understood was going to take a while. Something about it, the absolute practicality, the absence of performance, moved through him in a way he did not immediately have a name for. After a moment, he sat on the floor beneath her, back against the wall. The bond hummed between them, unspoken, neither of them reaching for it and neither of them able to fully ignore it. And the 6 hours began. He did not plan to tell her about Marin. He had not said Marin's name aloud in 9 years. Not to Soren, not to Drevian, not to the council members who had watched him return from the Harrow Rebellion, a different man, and had the wisdom never to ask why. Marin was the locked room inside everything else, the original door, the thing that had taught him, at considerable cost, that feeling was a liability he could not afford. But it was the 3rd hour, and April had asked, quietly, more thinking aloud than asking, why a man who felt nothing had held a position for 11 years that required feeling everything. And so he told her. Not the victory, not the strategy. He told her about the morning before the final battle, when Marin had stood in the gray pre-dawn and said she was afraid. He told her what he had said back, that fear was a choice, that Marin had looked at him with those clear, steady eyes and said, "Then I choose it anyway," and walked in regardless. She had not come out. He had won the battle. The silence after was different from the ones before. April did not fill it with comfort or the careful language people used around grief they were afraid of mishandling. She simply reached down, he was still on the floor below her, and turned her right forearm toward the light. The burn scar, old, uneven at the edges. "I was 12, she said quietly. "Someone I trusted told me to trust someone I shouldn't. When I understood what I'd done—" She stopped, turned her arm over slowly. "I needed to remember that understanding something too late still counts as understanding it." He looked at the scar for a long time. He did not touch the scar, did not offer her the symmetry of his own wound. They were not trading pain, they were simply existing in the same space without the performance of being other than what they were. 2 people who had spent their entire lives being precisely what each situation required and had run out of situations to perform for. The bond moved between them, quiet and constant, neither acknowledged nor denied. When the lockdown lifted at dawn, Caius stood and walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, did not turn. "The name on the border report," he said quietly, "the wolf who reported to Soren. I need to know if you recognize it." He said the name. The silence behind him lasted 1 second too long. "Caius," her voice stripped of everything except urgency, "that wolf has been dead for 3 months." "I watched it happen," she said. "Whatever name is on that report, someone put it there. Someone who knew you'd find it." She paused. "Someone who wanted you looking at Soren." He turned then. Her face confirmed what his chest already knew. Soren's morning report slid under the door. 19 dead on the border. 6 hours. 6 hours he had sat on a floor while 19 wolves paid the cost of his distraction in the only currency that could not be returned. He picked up the report, read it once, folded it, and understood with cold, complete clarity that whoever was running the third faction knew him well enough to know exactly what 6 hours alone with April would cost, which meant they had been watching long before the pardon, which meant this had never been about the girl, which meant it had always been about him. Soren put the evidence on the table without preamble. 7 messages. Dates, times, the cipher used, broken by Drevian's analyst 3 days ago, and held, Soren explained quietly, because the analyst had brought it to Drevian first before understanding that bringing things to Drevian first was no longer safe. 7 messages sent through the east wall rotation, once per week, every week, since the pardon. Caius read through them once. Then he said, "Leave me." Soren left. He sat with it for 2 hours, not pacing, not drinking, not doing any of the things men did when the ground shifted beneath them, just sitting with the lamplight and the evidence and the full, unbearable weight of a decision he could feel assembling itself in his chest, whether he wanted it to or not. He thought about the east wall in the dark, 12 inches of clearance, her wrist in his hand. He thought about a locked wing and a burn scar and 19 names on a border report that had slid under a door he had not opened for 6 hours. He thought about the third faction, the planted name, someone watching long before the pardon, running a board whose full shape he still could not see. He thought about the specific way she had said his name, Caius, like it was something she had decided to mean. He thought about all of it together, turning it in the cold analytical light that had built his kingdom, and he understood with absolute clarity that choosing her would cost him things he could not fully calculate yet. He also understood he was going to choose her anyway. He folded the messages, put them in his pocket, stood. The ceremony was nothing. No council, no court, no witnesses beyond Soren at the door with his hands clasped behind his back and his face composed into the careful neutrality of a man performing the most difficult act of loyalty of his life. No candles beyond the lamp already burning, no words beyond the ones required. Caius stood before April, and she looked at him, not grateful, not afraid, not performing anything, and he could see that she knew about the messages. It was there in the set of her jaw, the absolute stillness of her, the way she was waiting for him to demand the explanation she had been carrying since the pardon. He said nothing about the messages. He completed the bond. Her breath caught, once, involuntarily, at the moment it sealed, and he felt it move through him like the first real warmth in 9 years. That was the worst part. Not the weight of the choice, not the knowledge of what it would cost, not even the border reports stacking up in the war room like a slow accumulation of verdict. The worst part was Soren's face, steady, present, full of a grief too disciplined to show itself fully. The face of a man who had spent 11 years keeping a king alive and was watching that king make the one decision no amount of loyalty could protect him from. When it was done, Caius walked to the window. April did not move. The bond hummed between them, raw and new, an impossible thing existing in defiance of every law written before either of them was born. "The messages," she said quietly to his back. "I know." "Caius." "I know." His voice left no room. Not yet. She understood. He felt her understand it. Through the bond, a strange and terrible intimacy. Mother Voss found out at dawn. She was in the old council hall when Soren came to tell her formally, standing over her fire with a poker in her hand, adjusting coals that did not need adjusting. He told her. She did not turn around. She said nothing, just stood there with her back to him, tending her fire in the gray morning light, while somewhere above them a human woman wore a wolf's bond, and the kingdom outside the walls was already deciding what to do about it. Soren waited. He did not know what he was waiting for. Absolution, perhaps, or something that felt like it. Some acknowledgement from the oldest wolf in the castle that the thing that had just happened was survivable. She gave him neither. She simply tended the fire. And outside, a rider was already moving, carrying word to the noble houses before the sun had fully risen. In the war room, on the table where the evidence had been, a single message sat that Caius had not yet seen. Delivered in the night, slipped under the door, written in the same cipher April used, but not in April's hand. The letters slightly different in formation, the pressure of the pen heavier. Someone who had learned the cipher from her or from the same source she had learned it from. Someone who knew she was here. Someone who had been close enough to the East Wing last night to slip a message under a war room door in the middle of a castle on heightened alert. It sat there in the morning light, unopened, and the kingdom moved around it without knowing it existed, while inside it, everything that April had not yet told Caius waited to detonate. The coronation lasted 40 minutes. 3 noble houses had sent neutrality declarations by messenger before dawn: House Aldrich, House Fenmore, House Cray, each letter worded with the precise, careful language of wolves who were waiting to see which way the battle went. The empty seats in the coronation chamber were louder than anything Drevian said afterward. April stood straight through all of it. That was what they would remember. Not the crown, not the empty seats, not the king's face. The human woman standing straight as a blade in a room full of wolves who wanted her dead, wearing borrowed silk and a burn scar on her forearm, and an expression that gave nothing, that performed nothing, that simply existed with complete and devastating steadiness. Caius placed the crown on her head himself. The room went the specific quiet of a held breath. Lord Drevian did not wait. He stood before the crown had fully settled, and his voice carried the flat, controlled fury of a man who had prepared every word and intended each one to land with the weight of record. He cited the founding laws, the theological precedent, the 3 neutrality declarations, the border death toll, 31 now, 31 wolves in 8 days, and he laid it all at Caius's feet with the methodical care of someone constructing a case that would outlast the room it was made in. When he finished, the silence was absolute. Every eye moved to Caius. Caius looked at April. She was already looking at him, clear and steady and without appeal, those brown eyes that had refused to perform fear from the first moment they had found his across a council chamber. And he thought, she has known this was coming since the pardon. She has been waiting for it every single day. Then the doors opened. Not Draven's people, not any of the noble houses. The wolves who entered wore no house insignia, which in this kingdom meant only one thing, meant the faction operating outside noble structure, the faction that had put April across a border with a satchel full of maps and a mission she had slowly, deliberately, irrevocably failed to complete. They laid the messages on the council table. All 7 of them, plus 3 more that Caius had not seen, plus a record of dates and times and cipher keys that constructed for anyone in the room who needed convincing, an irrefutable picture of a human queen who had been feeding intelligence through the east wall rotation since the day of her pardon. The room did not erupt. It went colder than eruption. It went the cold of 40 wolves understanding simultaneously that they had been right. Every eye went to April. She did not deny it. did not confirm it, did not perform innocence or guilt or any of the shapes of scared she had told him in the interrogation room she did not know how to perform. She simply stood, straight, steady, the crown still on her head, and looked at Caius. Only at Caius. And what was in her eyes was not a plea. It was not an apology. It was the expression of a woman who had been carrying a truth for weeks that she had not been allowed to deliver on her own terms, and had just watched it detonated in a room full of wolves by the people she had been protecting him from, and was still, even now, not going to lie about it. She had always planned to tell him herself. They had taken that from her. Caius stood at the front of the chamber. 40 wolves waited. He thought about 7 messages, and what was in them and what was not in them. The intelligence that had been technically true and strategically hollow. The careful selection of information that satisfied a contact while protecting a kingdom. The particular discipline required to deceive your handlers without tipping them toward the suspicion that would get you killed. He thought about the third faction, the planted name, the assassin through the window, the unread message in the war room that neither of them had touched. He thought about a woman standing in a locked wing at 3 a.m. saying, "I'm terrified. I just don't know what shape of scared keeps me alive." The silence stretched past the point of ambiguity. Then he walked out. Not toward April, not toward the council, just out, through the side door, away from all of it, the door closing behind him with a sound like something final. The court erupted the moment it shut. Soren stood at the back of the chamber and let it happen for exactly 30 seconds. Then he moved. Not dramatically, not with the authority of a man making a speech, but with the quiet, lethal efficiency of someone who had decided that surviving the next 72 hours was the only thing he was permitted to feel right now. He spent 3 days holding the kingdom together alone. War room to border command to council hall and back. Decisions that required a king's seal made with nothing but his own authority and the force of a man determined not to let everything collapse before Caius remembered he was a king. The border outposts fell on the second day. 2 outposts. Northern positions. Undermanned since the noble house withdrawals, unable to hold without reinforcement that Soren did not authorize, and Caius was not answering to authorize. He wrote the reports anyway, slid them under the east tower door, did not know if they were being read. He told himself they were. He told himself the king was in that tower, reading every number, absorbing every name, building toward the moment he came back out and did what kings did, which was to make the unbearable choice and carry the weight of it upright, the way Caius had always carried every other weight in 11 years on the throne. He told himself this while sliding the 4th report under the door on the 3rd morning. He told himself this while standing in the corridor afterward, alone, listening to the silence on the other side. On the 3rd night, Soren went to the old council hall. Mother Voss was there, as she always was, tending a fire that had been burning in that hearth longer than either of them had been alive. He sat across from her without being invited, put the border report on the table between them, looked at it without speaking. The fire made the only sound in the room. "Was there anything," he said finally, quietly, "anything that could have stopped this?" She looked into the fire. The flames moved across her face, old and patient and full of the specific sorrow of someone who was right about something terrible and found no comfort in it whatsoever. She was quiet for long enough that the question filled the room entirely, took up all the space where an answer should have been. "I told him." The fire crackled. A log shifted. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, the kingdom breathed unevenly around the shape of what it had lost. Not just outposts, not just alliance, but the particular certainty that had been its foundation for 11 years, the belief that its king would always choose the kingdom first. A long pause. He already knew. Soren nodded once, the nod of a man absorbing something he had suspected, but needed confirmed by someone older and steadier than his own grief. He looked down at the border report, at the numbers, at the names of the wolves who had paid in the only currency that could not be returned for a choice they had not been consulted about. He did not speak again. Neither did she. They sat together as the fire burned lower. There was nothing left to say that the silence wasn't already saying, about kings who chose with full understanding of the cost, about wolves who paid that cost without being asked, about love that was real and ruinous and chosen anyway with open eyes and full knowledge of every name that would follow. Outside, the kingdom continued, wounded, fractured, restructured around the absence of the certainty that had once been its spine. The noble houses were already writing letters to each other, to Drevian in exile, to border commanders whose loyalty had always been to the throne and who were now being asked to decide whether the throne was still worth the loyalty. The question did not have a clean answer. It would not have one for a very long time. And in the East Tower, behind a door that had not opened in 3 days, a king sat with his mated human queen in the specific silence of two people who had burned the world down together and were only now beginning to understand that the world did not stop existing because you had stopped watching it. April sat by the window. She had been sitting there since the 2nd day, not waiting, not performing patience, just existing in the gray light with her hands in her lap and the bond humming between them and the knowledge of everything she still had not told him sitting in her chest like the burn scar on her arm. Present. Permanent. Hers to carry. She had not touched the unread message either. They had not spoken about it. They had not spoken about very much. It sat on the table where Caius had placed it on the first night. Unopened, its cipher intact, its contents still unknown to both of them. He had looked at it every day. He had not opened it. Part of him understood that not opening it was its own kind of cowardice, that a king who had walked out of a coronation chamber and slid into a tower while his kingdom bled outside had already spent 3 days proving that his wolf had won and his mind had lost, and the old woman by the fire had been right about every single thing. He picked it up. April turned from the window, watched him, said nothing. He broke the seal, read the first line, and everything, every assumption, every certainty, every version of the last 8 days he had constructed in his mind came apart at once. The message was not from the faction that had sent April. It was not from the third faction either, not from whoever had planted the name in the border report, not from the wolves who had come through the window, not from Drevian writing from exile. It was from Marin. Not her ghost, not a forgery, not a manipulation by someone who had done their research and found the one name that could unlock the locked room in Caius's chest. The handwriting was wrong for all of those, too specific, too full of the particular shorthand of two people who had known each other before either of them understood the cost of knowing people. Marin had not died in the Harrow Rebellion. She had been taken, and she had been held for 9 years by the faction that had sent April across the border, held as leverage against exactly this moment, against the day Caius found something worth destroying him over. April had known. He looked up from the message. April was still by the window, still watching him, still not performing anything, not guilt, not fear, not the careful preparation of an explanation, just watching him with those clear brown eyes the way she had watched him from the moment they dragged her into the chamber, the way she had watched him across every interrogation and confrontation and quiet hour between them, waiting, not for forgiveness, not for verdict, for him to decide what kind of man he was going to be now that the last version of himself had been taken apart completely. The fire in the old council hall was burning down to coals. Soren was still sitting across from Mother Voss in the dark. The kingdom was still bleeding outside the walls, and Caius held a letter from a dead woman who was not dead, written in the hand of the only person from his life before the crown, and understood with the cold and total clarity that had built everything he had just watched burn, that the game was never about April at all. It had always been about bringing him to exactly this room, exactly this choice, with exactly this much already lost. His wolf said nothing. For the first time since the pardon, neither did he.